This isn't advice, it's a warning. Because once you become aware of what's actually happening inside your mind, you lose something most people still have: innocence. You stop reacting on impulse. You stop taking words at face value. You start noticing patterns behind emotions, intentions behind kindness, and strategy behind silence. And once that switch flips, it never turns off. You'll begin thinking ahead while others are still feeling. You'll pause while they rush. You'll see consequences before actions are taken. That gap will give you an advantage, but it will also isolate you, because awareness separates you from the crowd. This isn't about being smarter, it's about seeing clearly, and clarity changes how you experience people forever. Some will use this to protect themselves. Others will use it to control. And many won't realize they're being controlled at all. What I'm about to show you already exists inside your mind. Most people just never learn to activate it. Once you do, you don't go back to thinking the same way again. Part 2. The invisible divide. There's a silent divide most people never notice. On one side are those who react. They feel first and act immediately. Emotion becomes action without inspection. Anger turns into words they can't take back. Fear turns into hesitation. Confidence turns into noise. On the other side are those who observe. They still feel the emotion, but they don't obey it. They watch it form. They question why it appeared. They consider what following it will cost. This is the difference between being inside the moment and standing slightly above it. Most people live their entire lives inside their reactions. Not because they're weak, but because no one ever taught them to pause. That pause is small, almost invisible, but inside it lives choice. And once you discover that choice, you stop being driven by emotions and start directing them. That's where real leverage begins. Part 3. Emotions are signals, not commands. Most people are taught, without anyone ever saying it out loud, that emotions are instructions. If you feel angry, you speak. If you feel anxious, you pull back. If you feel confident, you push forward. From childhood, reactions are rewarded or punished, but emotions themselves are never examined. So people grow up believing that whatever they feel in the moment is something they must obey. They don't question where it came from, what it means, or whether acting on it will actually help them. They simply react. That's why so many decisions are made in the heat of emotion and regretted later in silence. An emotion is not a decision. It's not a verdict. It's a signal. It's the nervous system flagging something it believes is important. But signals are only useful if they're interpreted correctly. Otherwise, they become noise. Take anger. Anger is often treated as strength, as justification, even as truth. But anger is rarely about the present moment alone. It usually appears when something deeper is threatened: pride, identity, status, control, or self-image. Two people can hear the same comment. One explodes. The other doesn't react at all. The difference isn't the comment, it's the meaning assigned to it. When anger isn't examined, it hijacks behavior. Words are said that can't be taken back. Relationships are damaged. Power is given away. But when anger is observed instead of obeyed, it changes. The moment you ask, "What is this really about?" the emotion loses intensity. Not because it disappears, but because you're no longer inside it. You're looking at it. That distance matters. Anxiety works the same way. People say, "I'm anxious," as if that explains something. But anxiety is rarely a single emotion. It's usually fear layered on top of uncertainty. Fear of judgment, fear of failure, fear of being exposed, fear of losing control. When anxiety is vague, it feels overwhelming. When it's broken into parts, it becomes manageable. The brain reacts strongly to unclear threats. It calms down when things are defined. That's why naming emotions works. It's not motivational or spiritual, it's neurological. When you label an emotion accurately, activity shifts away from the reactive emotional centers and toward the parts of the brain responsible for reasoning and planning. In simple terms, your mind stops spiraling and starts organizing. This is why emotionally aware people seem calm under pressure. They're not suppressing emotion, they're processing it. Most people never learn this, so they live in emotional autopilot. They snap, avoid, over-explain, or self-sabotage, then justify it by saying, "That's just how I felt." But feelings are not commands. They're information, and information should be evaluated before action. People who don't do this become predictable. Trigger them, and they respond the same way every time. Raise your voice, and they shut down. Question them, and they get defensive. Ignore them, and they spiral. Predictability makes people easy to influence, easy to provoke, easy to control. Awareness breaks that pattern. When you observe emotions instead of fusing with them, you stop being pulled around by every internal surge. Someone tries to provoke you, and you pause. Someone pressures you, and you slow down. Someone expects an emotional reaction and gets nothing. That absence of reaction unsettles people who rely on emotional leverage. This doesn't mean you ignore emotions. It means you consult them instead of obeying them. You ask what the emotion is trying to protect, what belief triggered it, and what response will actually serve you long-term. Most emotional mistakes come from short-term relief. Saying something because it feels good in the moment, avoiding something because it feels safer now. Metacognition shifts your focus forward, 3 moves ahead. What happens after I react? What pattern am I reinforcing if I act this way? That question alone separates reaction from strategy. This is where real emotional mastery begins, not with suppression, not with positivity, but with interpretation. When emotions stop commanding and start informing, you gain something rare. Control without numbness, calm without weakness, clarity without detachment. And once you experience emotions this way, you never experience them the same again. Part 4. Your thoughts are not you. Most people assume that if a thought appears in their mind, it must be true. They don't question it. They don't examine it. They don't even notice it arrive. They just believe it. That's one of the most dangerous mistakes a human can make. Because thoughts are not facts. They are suggestions. They are automatic outputs produced by habit, memory, fear, conditioning, and past experience. And if you don't learn to observe them, they quietly run your life in the background. Think about how often a thought like this appears. I'm not good enough. This will probably fail. They don't respect me. I shouldn't say anything. Most people don't stop to ask where these thoughts came from. They don't question whether the thought is useful, accurate, or even relevant to the current situation. They assume the thought is them. But it's not. A thought is just a mental event passing through awareness. No different than a sound passing your ears or a cloud crossing the sky. The problem is that most people grab onto every thought and identify with it. Once that happens, the thought becomes identity. And identity drives behavior. Many of your thoughts were never chosen. They were inherited from parents, installed by teachers, reinforced by failure, or planted by other people's opinions. Some are echoes of old embarrassment. Some are defense mechanisms. Some are fears that once served a purpose but no longer do. Yet they still speak with authority in your mind. Metacognition introduces a radical shift. You stop being the thought and start watching it. Instead of, I am not capable, it becomes, I'm noticing a thought that says I'm not capable. That small shift creates separation. And separation is power. When you observe a thought instead of merging with it, it loses its ability to dictate your actions. It can still exist, but it no longer controls. You get to decide whether it deserves attention or dismissal. This is where most people resist. Because questioning thoughts feels uncomfortable. It challenges identity. It exposes how much of your inner world runs on autopilot. But once you develop this habit, patterns start to emerge. You notice that certain thoughts appear at specific moments, before speaking up, before taking risks, before asserting boundaries. You realize those thoughts aren't truth. They're protection mechanisms. They exist to keep you safe, small, or familiar. Not necessarily successful, not necessarily fulfilled. Fear-based thoughts tend to be repetitive, exaggerated, and emotionally charged. They speak in absolutes. Always, never, everyone, no one. They predict disaster without evidence. Fact-based thoughts are quieter, neutral, specific, grounded. Metacognition teaches you to tell the difference. You begin asking questions like, is this thought helping me or limiting me? Is it based on evidence or assumption? Who benefited when this belief was formed? Would I advise someone else to believe this? Most thoughts fall apart under gentle inspection. And when they do, something strange happens. Mental space opens up. Instead of reacting automatically, you pause. Instead of spiraling, you slow down. Instead of assuming the worst, you wait for clarity. This is why people who master this skill appear mentally strong. They're not free from negative thoughts. They're free from obedience to them. They don't argue with every thought. They don't fight them. They just don't let them drive. That's an important distinction. Trying to eliminate thoughts is exhausting and impossible. Observing them is simple and sustainable. Over time, this changes how you relate to yourself. You stop being hostile toward your own mind. You stop panicking every time doubt appears. You recognize that doubt is just a visitor, not a command. This also makes you harder to manipulate. People who can't distinguish thoughts from truth are easy to influence. Suggest an idea and they internalize it. Question their worth and they spiral. Apply pressure and they collapse inward. But when you know that thoughts are not reality, external influence loses its grip. You don't immediately accept praise or criticism as truth. You don't absorb others' projections. You don't spiral from a single comment or look. You evaluate before you accept. This is where mental freedom begins. Not by controlling thoughts, but by refusing to be controlled by them. And once you experience that separation, you realize something profound. You are not your thoughts. You are the one who notices them. That awareness changes everything. Part 5. Seeing the game behind the words. Most people think conversations are about words. They focus on what was said. They replay sentences. They argue over phrasing. But words are only the surface layer. Every interaction has another level running underneath it. A silent exchange of power, emotion, and intention. Most people feel it, but they don't know how to read it, so they react blindly. Metacognition turns that vague feeling into clarity. You begin to notice how things are said instead of just what is said. Tone shifts, timing, pauses, eye contact, energy changes. These are not random. They are information leaking out in real time. A hesitation before answering often signals uncertainty or internal conflict. Over-explaining usually hides insecurity or guilt. Forced laughter masks discomfort. Sudden silence often signals power being applied, not withdrawn. Once you see this, conversations slow down in your mind, even if they move fast in real life. You're no longer emotionally swept along. You're observing patterns while participating. This is where most people get uncomfortable because it feels like stepping outside the script everyone else is following. You start to see that many interactions are not about truth or logic. They're about status, validation, and control. People interrupt to dominate. They mirror to build rapport. They withdraw to punish. They joke to test boundaries. None of this requires malice. Much of it is unconscious. But unconscious behavior is still behavior, and still predictable. When you're not aware of these dynamics, you're pulled into them automatically. Someone raises their voice, and you feel compelled to defend yourself. Someone goes cold, and you feel the urge to explain or apologize. Someone pressures you with urgency, and you rush to comply. That's how power moves unnoticed. But once you begin observing instead of reacting, those hooks lose strength. You don't rush to fill silence. You don't over-justify your position. You don't mirror anxiety back to the other person. You wait. And waiting shifts the dynamic. Silence becomes information instead of discomfort. A pause becomes leverage instead of panic. You allow the other person to reveal more than they intended because you're no longer rushing to manage the emotional flow. This is why people who understand social dynamics often say very little. They don't need to control the conversation. They let it expose itself. You also start noticing patterns across time. Who only contacts you when they need something, who becomes supportive only when you're useful, who withdraws affection after disagreement. These aren't isolated incidents. They're strategies, sometimes conscious, often not. Metacognition gives you the ability to zoom out. Instead of reacting to moments, you read sequences. Instead of focusing on tone, you focus on trends. And trends tell the truth. This awareness doesn't make you cold. It makes you grounded. You're no longer confused by mixed signals or emotional whiplash. You see what's happening without needing it explained. This is also where people become harder to manipulate. Manipulation depends on speed, emotion, and confusion. When you slow down internally, stay neutral emotionally, and observe instead of absorb, the tactic collapses. You don't accuse, you don't confront, you simply don't respond the way they expect. That alone breaks the pattern. At this stage, conversations stop feeling random. They feel structured, predictable, almost mechanical, not because people are fake, but because behavior follows rules. Once you understand those rules, you're no longer playing the game blindly. You're watching it happen in real time. And that changes everything about how you move through the world. Part 6. Why this knowledge feels dangerous. At a certain point, awareness stops feeling empowering and starts feeling unsettling. Not because it's wrong, but because it removes comfort. When you begin to see emotional patterns, social strategies, and psychological tactics clearly, you also begin to see how often they're used. And that realization can't be undone. You notice how frequently fear is leveraged, how often guilt is applied, how silence is used as pressure, how praise is timed to influence behavior. And you realize something uncomfortable. Many people are not acting randomly. They are acting strategically, even if unconsciously. This is where the knowledge starts to feel dangerous, because the same awareness that protects you can also be used to control others. Once you understand how emotions drive behavior, you know exactly where people are vulnerable. Once you can read hesitation, insecurity, and need in real time, you also know how to exploit it. And that's the line most people don't talk about. Metacognition itself is neutral. It's just awareness. But awareness paired with ego, resentment, or hunger for power turns into manipulation very quickly. You see how easy it would be to guide someone's decisions without ever giving a command, to frame questions in ways that steer their thinking, to use silence to create anxiety, to give validation sparingly so it becomes addictive. You understand why these tactics work, because they work on emotion, not logic. That realization can feel heavy, because now you can't pretend ignorance. You can no longer say, "I didn't see it." You did see it. And you also can't pretend you don't know how influence operates. This is why people who develop deep psychological awareness often go through a phase of discomfort or cynicism. They feel like the world is more manipulative than they thought. In reality, the world hasn't changed. Your perception has. Most manipulation isn't dramatic or malicious. It's subtle. It's everyday. It's people trying to get their needs met without direct confrontation. People avoiding rejection. People protecting fragile identities. But subtle manipulation still shapes outcomes. It still affects relationships. It still determines who holds power. It still decides who adapts and who breaks. The danger appears when someone starts believing that because they can influence, they should. This is where awareness mutates. Instead of observing emotions, they start engineering them. Instead of noticing insecurity, they start activating it. Instead of protecting boundaries, they start eroding others. They stop asking, "What's happening here?" and start asking, "How do I use this?" That's when metacognition turns from shield to weapon. And here's the part most people don't want to admit. The temptation is real. Once you realize how predictable emotional reactions are, it's easy to justify small manipulations. Just to smooth things over. Just to keep control. Just to win this one interaction. But small manipulations compound. They train people around you to respond to pressure instead of honesty. They create dynamics built on unspoken leverage instead of trust. And eventually, they isolate you, because relationships based on control always decay. This is why the knowledge feels dangerous, not because it harms you automatically, but because it gives you the option to harm. Power always reveals character. Metacognition strips away excuses. You can no longer say, "I didn't know what I was doing." You did. You saw the pattern. You recognized the lever. What you chose to do with it is on you. That's the weight of awareness. It forces a decision, not once, but constantly. Will you use clarity to protect yourself and others, or will you use it to dominate and extract? This is where mastery stops being technical and becomes ethical. Because the most dangerous thing about this knowledge isn't that others can manipulate you, it's realizing that you could manipulate them, and choosing not to. Part 7. The Mask of Weakness. Not all control looks aggressive. Some of the most manipulative dynamics don't come from people who appear dominant, confident, or intimidating. They come from those who appear fragile, wounded, or in need of rescue. This is where many people get trapped. We're conditioned to associate weakness with harmlessness. We assume someone who is struggling, emotional, or vulnerable couldn't possibly be controlling the situation. But that assumption is exactly what allows certain patterns to work. The mask of weakness is powerful because it bypasses suspicion. It activates empathy, responsibility, and guilt in others. When someone presents themselves as broken or overwhelmed, the instinct is to help, to soften, to compensate. Boundaries loosen. Critical thinking shuts down. At first, it looks like openness, oversharing early, intense emotional disclosure, stories of being misunderstood, abandoned, or mistreated. You feel special for being trusted, chosen, needed. But information is power. Every insecurity you hear, every fear you comfort, every boundary you relax, it all becomes data. Over time, the dynamic shifts. You start feeling responsible for their emotional state. Disagreement feels cruel. Distance feels like betrayal. You begin editing yourself to avoid hurting them. That's not connection. That's conditioning. This pattern often operates quietly. There are no threats, no raised voices, just disappointment, withdrawal, sadness, or subtle reminders of how much they've been through. The message isn't spoken directly, but it's understood. If you pull away, I fall apart. That pressure is control. And because it's wrapped in vulnerability, it's difficult to name without feeling heartless. People stay far longer than they should because leaving feels like abandoning someone who needs them. But real vulnerability invites choice. Manipulative vulnerability removes it. Another variation of this mask is strategic incompetence, acting helpless to avoid responsibility, playing confused to gain sympathy, presenting as incapable so others step in and overfunction. Over time, roles harden. One person carries emotional weight, the other benefits from it, and any attempt to rebalance the dynamic is met with hurt, confusion, or collapse. Metacognition helps you see the difference between genuine pain and weaponized fragility. You start asking different questions. Does this person take responsibility for their emotions? Do they respect boundaries once they're stated? Do they grow when supported? Or stay dependent? Patterns matter more than stories. Everyone struggles. Everyone has pain. But when vulnerability consistently results in others shrinking, sacrificing, or self-erasing, something else is happening. This awareness can feel cold at first. It challenges the idea that empathy alone is enough. But empathy without discernment leads to entanglement, not connection. Seeing the mask of weakness doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop being controlled by care. You can offer compassion without surrendering agency. You can support without becoming responsible. You can listen without absorbing. That balance is difficult. Most people never learn it. But once you see how weakness can be used as leverage, you stop confusing intensity with depth and neediness with love. And that clarity protects you from dynamics that slowly drain, confuse, and bind, all while appearing harmless on the surface. Because not all traps look like cages. Some look like someone asking you not to leave. Part 8. Turning awareness into armor. At some point, awareness stops being about understanding others and starts being about protecting yourself. Because seeing patterns without knowing how to respond can leave you exposed. You notice manipulation, pressure, and emotional games. But if you still react automatically, the knowledge doesn't help. Protection begins with one simple habit: the pause. The pause interrupts emotional momentum. It prevents you from answering immediately, agreeing reflexively, or defending yourself unnecessarily. Most psychological tactics rely on speed, catching you before you think. When you slow down internally, those tactics lose force. You don't explain right away. You don't fill silence. You don't rush to reassure. You observe. This doesn't mean becoming cold or distant. It means becoming deliberate. When someone applies pressure, you notice how they do it. Is it urgency, guilt, withdrawal, praise followed by expectation? The moment you identify the lever, it stops working automatically. Awareness turns emotional hooks into visible tools. Another layer of armor is neutrality. Emotional neutrality doesn't mean lack of feeling. It means not broadcasting your internal state. When people can't read immediate reactions, they lose the ability to steer you easily. This is why calm presence is so powerful. It creates uncertainty for anyone trying to manipulate. They don't know if their tactic landed. They don't know which button worked. Silence, when chosen, becomes strength. You also begin setting cleaner boundaries, not with long explanations, but with consistency. You don't argue about your limits. You demonstrate them. People who respect you adapt. People who relied on pressure reveal themselves. This is an important filter. Metacognition doesn't require confrontation. In fact, it often makes confrontation unnecessary. You simply stop responding in ways that reward manipulation. No emotional payoff, no frantic reassurance, no overfunctioning. Over time, unhealthy dynamics collapse on their own because they're no longer being fed. This kind of protection also applies internally. When old fears surface, you don't panic. You observe. When intrusive thoughts appear, you don't spiral. You note them and move on. You become harder to rush by others or by your own emotions. This doesn't make you passive. It makes you grounded. Grounded people are difficult to destabilize because they're not operating from reactivity. They choose when to engage and when to step back. They don't need to win every interaction. They don't need to be understood immediately. They trust their clarity. The goal isn't dominance, it's immunity. Immunity from emotional manipulation. Immunity from pressure-based decisions. Immunity from old patterns running your life. When awareness becomes armor, you move differently. You don't flinch at silence. You don't chase validation. You don't collapse under urgency. You remain steady. And steadiness, more than intensity, is what protects you in a world full of psychological noise. Because the person who can't be rushed can't be controlled. Part 9. The observer position. There's a mental position most people never discover. They live inside their thoughts, inside their emotions, inside every interaction, fully immersed, fully identified. When something happens, they are the reaction. There's no distance between the event and their inner world. The observer position changes that. It's the ability to step slightly outside yourself while still being present. You're in the conversation. but you're also watching yourself in it. You're feeling the emotion, but you're also noticing it form. You're thinking the thought, but you're aware that it's just a thought. This isn't detachment, it's perspective. When you access the observer position, your inner dialogue changes. Instead of, "I'm panicking," it becomes, "I'm noticing panic arise." Instead of, "They're disrespecting me," it becomes, "I'm interpreting this as disrespect." That shift sounds subtle, but it's profound. Because the moment you can describe an experience, you're no longer trapped inside it. This position gives you time. Time to choose words carefully. Time to notice body language. Time to sense when an emotion doesn't actually belong to the present moment but to an old memory or pattern. You start catching yourself mid-reaction, mid-assumption, mid-spiral. And that interruption is powerful. The observer position also reveals how much of human behavior is automatic. You begin to notice how often people are reacting to their own internal narratives rather than to what's actually happening. You see arguments that are really about pride, defensiveness that's really about fear, confidence that's compensating for insecurity. You stop taking things as personally, not because you don't care, but because you see the machinery behind the behavior. This makes you harder to provoke. When someone tries to get a rise out of you, you feel the impulse, but you also see it. You notice the hook before it catches. That awareness alone weakens the pull. Instead of reacting, you respond, or you don't. Silence becomes an option instead of a threat. Calm becomes a choice instead of a personality trait. Internally, the observer position changes your relationship with discomfort. When anxiety or doubt appears, you don't immediately try to escape it. You watch it. You let it move through without turning it into a story. Most suffering doesn't come from emotion itself. It comes from the narrative built around it. The observer position cuts that narrative short. You realize that emotions rise, peak, and fall on their own if they're not fed with interpretation and resistance. You don't need to solve every feeling. Some just need to be witnessed. Over time, this creates emotional resilience. You're no longer afraid of intense feelings because you know you won't drown in them. You've stood above the current before. You trust your ability to watch without collapsing. This also sharpens judgment. When you're not flooded emotionally, you make clearer decisions. You see trade-offs. You anticipate consequences. You don't confuse urgency with importance. The observer position is where strategy lives. Not cold calculation, but calm awareness. The kind that allows you to see the whole board instead of just the square you're standing on. People who operate from this position often seem grounded, hard to read, and difficult to manipulate. Not because they're hiding, but because they're not leaking. They don't give away their internal state easily. They don't rush to resolve tension. They don't explain themselves into exhaustion. They act from clarity, not compulsion. And once this position becomes familiar, you start returning to it automatically. In conflict, in pressure, in uncertainty, it becomes your default. You're no longer living as every thought and feeling. You're living as the one who notices them, and that changes the way you move through everything. Part 10. The line you don't come back from. Once you develop this level of awareness, there's no reset button. You can't unsee patterns. You can't unknow how influence works. You can't go back to believing every emotion, every thought, every interaction is random or innocent. You start noticing who reacts and who responds, who uses pressure and who uses clarity, who respects boundaries and who quietly tests them. And you'll notice something else that's harder to sit with. You'll notice your own power. You'll realize you can stay silent and shift a room, that you can slow a conversation just by not rushing, that you can influence outcomes simply by not reacting the way people expect. This is the line. On one side is awareness used for stability, self-control, and protection. On the other side is awareness used for dominance, manipulation, and control. The difference isn't skill, it's intention. Real mastery isn't about making others predictable. It's about making yourself unmovable. Because when you're unmovable, you don't need to control anyone. You don't need emotional leverage. You don't need to win every interaction. You choose when to engage. You choose when to walk away. You choose when silence says more than words ever could. That's real power. And it's rare. If this video shifted how you think, don't let it end here. Subscribe to IRFYpedia on YouTube for more deep psychological tools, mental frameworks, and strategies you can actually use in real life. And here's my question for you. Which part of your life do you think this awareness will change the most? Your relationships, your work, or the way you see yourself? Write your answer in the comments.